Okay. All right. So we're going to hop into talking about our second tissue of the body. Last time we talked about the study of tissue in general and the histology. And then we talked about our first tissue type, which is epithelial tissue. So now we'll jump into the second tissue type, which is connective tissue. Okay. So let's talk about some general kind of characteristics of it. And then we'll get into the specific types. And this is another one that has a lot of slides. I think there's almost 50 slides today, but a lot of it is pictures. Okay, so a lot of it's just images and looking at those. Okay, so it is a lot, but yeah, that's just kind of the nature of these histology ones because they're really picture heavy. And so yeah, okay. So connective tissue. It is the most abundant tissue in the body. We have way more of this than we have anything else. Okay, these are kind of its general functions, right? So it provides the body with strength and support, gives the body shape, holds organs in place. For example, bone is one of our connective tissues. Okay, it's very important for providing protection in many ways. It lies underneath the epithelial layer of our skin, provides us protection there, soft packing around our organs. So bone, skin, fat, all of these types of connective tissue are helpful for protecting us. Okay, insulation. Okay, adipose tissue, also, which is fat, is a connective tissue, helps insulate our bodies. Okay, transporting substances around the body, that's our blood. Blood is considered one of the connective tissues as well. We don't think of it as a tissue because it's just moving around all over the place, but it's considered one of the tissues. Okay, some features. Instead of having avascular, like we had in the epithelial tissue, no blood supply, this has degrees of vascularity. Okay, so some tissue, some connective tissue is extremely well vascularized. Okay, and some doesn't have any blood in it at all. Okay, one of the ones with the most rich blood supply is bone. Actually, we don't typically think about bone being heavily vascularized, but it has lots and lots of blood inside of bone. Okay, I'll tell a quick story from when I was in college to make that hit home, which always makes it hit home for me. When I was a student here, so I was the athletic training major, and at that point there was a little less regulation around athletic training. There were definitely less certified athletic trainers kind of at place at high schools. And so my senior year, I got hired to be the athletic trainer at a high school in the South Bay. And I wasn't licensed or anything, but that was just how they did it back then. And I was working the JV football game. JV football games can be extremely dangerous for multiple reasons. One of the reasons is some of the kids are big and they've hit puberty and they're strong and they're fast. And then there's the kids that haven't hit puberty yet and they're tiny and they're not strong and they get ran over by the big guys. Right? And so case in point, it was actually the first play of the game, kickoff, which is also one of the most dangerous things during a football game is kickoff, right? Because everybody just running full speed at each other, right? And Zach, same idea. This big kid just blows over this little guy, and he's on the ground. So I go out there, and he's just laying there. I think I broke my leg. He was really calm, and I'm like, I don't think you broke your leg if you're that calm. And I looked, and I could see right in the shaft of his tibia. It was sticking out of his shin right here. And I just saw right down the middle of it, and it was just dark red blood just pouring out of his tibia. It was very, very vascularized. I'll always remember that. But, yeah, compound fracture of his tibia. It was pretty nasty. Ended up having to have surgeries to put a rod in there to hold it together and stuff. But yeah, I actually went home. I was living in a house off campus with some buddies, and I went home and I even noticed, but they're like, dude, you got blood on your shoes. I'm like, oh. Yeah, so that's how I'll always remember there's a lot of blood in bone. Okay. But, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that tissue has a lot of blood in it. But then other ones like cartilage have pretty much no blood supply to them. Okay, so we have within the same tissue type, we have this great variability in how much blood we get in bone. Okay, one of the other features of connective tissue is it's again primarily extracellular matrix. Okay, just a few cells scattered about, but then mostly it's the other stuff that makes up connective tissue, which is the exact opposite of epithelial tissue, right? It was almost all cells and very little extracellular matrix. Okay, so some of the elements that we find in connective tissue, there's always going to be different protein fibers. as well as different cells that we'll find. And we'll kind of go through some examples of these general cell types and general protein fibers we find in connective tissue. Okay, so again, that extracellular matrix, it's that space that's not inside of cells. Okay, and so it's also not inside of blood vessels either. So it's that kind of third space that is outside of cells, outside of blood vessels. It's just everywhere else in the body. Okay? Also known as the interstitial space. Okay. Yeah, and then cells, we'll talk about some different cell types that we find in different types of connective tissue. Okay, so let's talk about those 3 protein fibers that we find, the 3 general ones. So collagen is the most common protein in the body. Somewhere around 1/3 to 1/4 of our total body protein is made up of this. And about 6% of our body weight is protein. So most of us have somewhere around, on average, around 3 to 4 pounds of this protein in our bodies. Okay. What it looks like is these ropes of 3 strands, and then they spontaneously wind around each other. Okay, so we can kind of see that here. See those 3 strands that kind of wind around each other. And then those bigger 3 strands wind around other ones of 3 strands, and it keeps kind of winding up into this extremely strong fiber. Okay, so extremely high tensile strength. So what that means is if we pulled it from end to end this way, it's very hard to break that way. Okay, we can get into some trouble if we get a force coming across. Okay, right, but just pulling straight from end to end, it's very, very strong that way. Okay, these ones are called the white fibers because they just look white under microscopes. Okay, and so they're somewhat flexible. We can stretch them, but they don't really bounce back quite so well. They're not super elastic. Okay, that's what the elastic part of that is. Okay, and actually, pound for pound, if we had a steel cable the same width as a collagen fiber, collagen has more tensile strength than steel cables does. Okay, all right, so that's collagen. We also have elastic fibers. Okay, so they're very long, definitely thinner than the collagen. Okay, but the main protein inside of them, instead of collagen, is elastin. Okay, and just like the name sounds, it's much more elastic. Okay, it's actually coiled up. It kind of looks like a spring if we were able to get even closer to it than what we have there in the microscope. Okay, so what elastic means is we can stretch it, but then not only can we stretch it, but after we take that pressure off of it, it returns to its original state. Okay, same idea with compressing it. If we smash it down, it bounces back, expands back to where it was after we take that pressure off. These ones are typically known as yellow fiber. They look somewhat yellow under the microscope. Okay, so it's the elastic ones, and then lastly, the reticular fibers. These are very thin, very short. Okay, they are made out of collagen. Okay, and they're continuous with collagen, so they're kind of wound into those larger collagen cables all throughout our connective tissue. Okay, they definitely have more give than the larger collagen. We can kind of stretch them out more. Okay, we find these a lot around capillaries and other small blood vessels. Okay, all right, so let's do this one real quick. Okay, so out of those 3 protein fibers, which protein fiber is not primarily made up of collagen? Go ahead. Double check with the people on your team there. All right, we got 59 of you. How many we got today? 63. Anybody else? Everybody get it in? Okay. All right, everybody good? All right, so 64 today. Okay, see what you guys said. Good. So 98% of you are saying C, those elastic fibers, because the primary protein in there is elastin, whereas the primary protein in the other ones is collagen. Okay. All right, so let's talk, that's the kind of 3 primary protein fibers we find in connective tissue, but then the different cells, okay? So there's some kind of nomenclature here that's important to wrap your head around, because you'll see these kind of prefixes and suffixes show up all throughout the rest of the class. Okay, so when we see the term blast within a cell type name, that means that it is going to be the one that helps us create that extracellular matrix. Okay, think about it kind of blasting out proteins, right? It's making proteins and then blasting them out into the extracellular matrix. Okay, so we'll see fibroblasts, osteoblasts are two examples we'll talk about. Fibroblasts are the most common cell type in connective tissue. Those are the ones that are blasting out all those protein fibers. They're making those protein fibers for us, sending them into the extracellular space. When we see sites, sites really just mean cell. Site means cell. Okay, so when we see site, this is kind of the basic cell of a certain tissue. Okay, these are the ones that are there just to maintain the tissue, maintain the matrix. And so chondrocytes are cartilage cells, osteocytes are bone cells, adipocytes are fat cells. Okay, we'll have other examples like that. Okay, yeah, and then we have different immune cells kind of roaming around in connective tissue. Okay, looking for things that aren't supposed to be there, like macrophages, some lymphocytes, and mast cells. Okay, so you can kind of see what those different cells might look like in that image there on the right. Okay, all right, take a second with the people around you real quick in your team, just to kind of do a quick compare and contrast of connective tissue versus epithelial tissue, okay? So ET is epithelial tissue, CT is connective tissue, okay? Just compare and contrast those things based on these little prompts here, okay? Go ahead, do that for a couple minutes and then we'll come back.
Learn something new every day.
Nice.
I never knew that blast meant that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, nice.
Never stop learning.
Yeah, for sure, man.
So epithelial hive.
I think that's right. We'll wait for that. Okay, polarity. That's how you define it. ET, apical, and basal.
All right, guys, let's come back together here for a sec. I know not all of you are done yet. That's okay. We can walk through it together here. I saw some of you writing stuff in, much to your dismay. Nothing's going to uncover there. So you got to write it in. Okay. But okay, cell to matrix ratio. Epithelial tissue is almost all what? Epithelial tissue is almost all what? Cells. Got it. Okay. All cells, not really all cells. We'll say almost all cells. Okay. Whereas connective tissue is almost all what? Okay. Extra cellular matrix. Okay. The polarity thing, where does that come into play? Which tissue cells have polarity? Epithelia, right? So we got the apical side versus the basal side. Okay, so ET, we got apical versus basal. Okay, vascularity with epithelial tissue, what do we say about its vascularity? Avascular, we can just say there's none. Connective tissue, what do we say about it? Varying degrees, yeah, so. Okay, epithelial tissue is what as far as proliferation goes? Yeah, highly proliferative, right? Lots of cell turnover. We're constantly replacing the cells because they're constantly getting damaged, getting stresses put on them. Okay. There's two primary functions of epithelial tissue. What were those two primary functions? So there's kind of two big types, right? There's a covering and lining type. Okay, so it covers stuff, lines stuff, seals things off, okay? And then the other part does what? Yeah, it's glandular, it secretes things, right? So the glandular part, secretion. Okay, this could be exocrine, things we want to get out, or mucus that we need to be on the surface of something, or it could be endocrine, things like hormones and other things that are going to be communicating throughout the body, okay? The main functions of connective tissue, name some out. Strength, good, support, okay, protection. Those are probably the three primary ones. There's others too, like with blood, with transportation, other things. Those are probably the three primary ones. Okay. All right. I'll leave this up for a sec, but if you want to flip to the next page, if you're done, you can start looking at that clicker question there. Take a guess if you don't have a clue what that is, but can't remember if I put a question on that in the Master in A&P or not this week. But all right, if you're not sure, just take a guess. Go ahead and send something in there. So when we talk about an undifferentiated cell, that means a cell that could turn into a different type of cell. Okay, this is kind of getting close to what we would consider a stem cell, right? A stem cell is a cell we could put into a tissue and then it would turn into whatever type of cell that's in that tissue, theoretically, right? So this is kind of a little one step beyond a stem cell. Okay, and we've kind of honed in on D there. About 47% of you are saying D, but then we're pretty spread out after that. But mesenchyme is definitely the cell type here. Okay. Okay, so mesenchymal cells. We see this whole kind of family tree of mesenchymal cells here. Okay, so they can turn into bone, cartilage, also muscle, which is not connective tissue, right? Marrow, tendons, ligaments, adipose tissue, all those different types of connective tissue. So this is kind of the high up in the cell line where all of these things eventually can turn into these, differentiate into different types of cells. Okay, all right. Okay, and so this is what mesenchyme looks like underneath the microscope. Okay, this will be one of the tissues you need to recognize. Okay, it's kind of known for kind of having these star-shaped cells, a very fluid-like ground substance, and the ground substance is really the substance that's in that extracellular matrix. Okay, you'll see that term ground substance throughout. That's just kind of what's out in the extracellular matrix. Okay, some of it looks a lot more solid than that, so this one is one that's more fluid-like. Okay, very fine protein fibrils. We can see a little bit of those. They almost look a little bit like sperm cells, not exactly, but yeah. So that's kind of how mesenchyme looks. You can see another look at it here. Okay, a little bit further out, not quite as zoomed in. Okay, so mesenchyme would look like there. And then one more, just a bigger image of that same one, the picture you had before. See, so 40 slides can go fast if you got a bunch like that, right? Okay. Okay. All right. Oh yeah, one thing just popped back in my head right now. I forgot to mention. Those of you that are trying to meet with me for office hours, a lot of you keep asking, where is the kinesiology building? And so if you're on Calf Lane up by the bottom of the Cooper Music Building, you go down those big stairs towards the gym, you know, the big stairs that go from Calf Lane to the gym. You get right down to the big doors of the gym, and just kind of hook around to the left or the south side of the gym. There's like a corridor between the gym and the next building over, and that next building over is the kinesiology building. You go about halfway down, it just says Department of Kinesiology right there on the left, and you'll see it. Okay, so it's kind of like up above the tennis courts is pretty much where it is. And then the other thing about that too is it's been great to sit on the shuttle with you guys and chat, and I always enjoy that. But I can also use that time wisely too. So if you want to have office hours with me on the shuttle one day, then just come tell me after class, and we'll sit together and I can pull up your test on my iPad. We can take a look at it, whatever we need. That's always a way to be efficient with time. So, all right. Okay, let's jump into our second connective tissue here. This one's called areolar connective tissue. Okay, so kind of a more gel-like matrix, a little bit more solid. Okay, lots of the cells we find in this type of connective tissue are fibroblasts, which we'll have in most types of connective tissue. Okay, the two locations that you'll need to know is we find it underneath epithelial tissue. Okay, this is part of that basement membrane that we looked at with the epithelial tissue. Right, we had that basement membrane that contained part epithelial tissue and then part connective tissue. This is the connective tissue part of that. Okay, so this is very good for a diffusion space. Okay, because it's fluid-like, and that makes sense, right? Because if there's no blood flow to epithelial tissue, we better have a nice liquidy space next to it in the tissue that does have blood flow, so we can get nutrients to that epithelial tissue. Right? Okay, it's kind of known as a universal packing material throughout the body. It's kind of wrapped around lots of different things, but we always find it here underneath epithelial tissue. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Okay, we can actually make out those fibroblasts a little bit here. We can see some elastic protein fibers there. We can see some bigger collagen fibers here. Okay, it's also known as loose connective tissue. That's kind of the other term for it. Loose connective tissue or even loose areolar connective tissue. Okay, another image of it like this, a little bit further out. That one can be slightly confused with the mesenchyme one. But there's more protein fibers than we saw in the mesenchyme, a little bit thicker, a little bit denser protein fibers than mesenchyme. Okay. All right, so another one, adipose tissue. Okay, adipose tissue is kind of an exception for connective tissue in that it's mostly cells. Okay, there's not really much extracellular matrix. Okay, so they're very closely packed, has this kind of chicken wire appearance. Okay, and the interesting part about it is that it's kind of like, it's still kind of like connective tissue as far as the extracellular matrix goes, but we just happen to have all of the stuff that would be in the extracellular matrix actually inside of cells instead of outside of cells. Okay, so these fat cells are just totally packed full of different types of lipids. Okay, so much so that the nucleus is always pushed completely to one side of the cell. Okay, and you'll notice that these big cells, usually whitish, and then there's this little nucleus kind of pushed off to the side of the cell. Okay, so it's big functions: energy storage, insulation, supports and protects organs. The three locations you'll need to know of it. Okay, subcutaneous, this is right underneath our skin. All right, surrounding our kidneys, we have these kidney fat pads that really protect our kidneys well. And then the mammary glands. Okay, and this one's pretty recognizable under the microscope. These big white cells, again, with little nuclei kind of pushed off to the side here, like you can see there. Okay, so they're really just packed full of lipids, which kind of takes the place of that extracellular matrix we would normally see in connective tissue. Okay, close-up view of adipose tissue there. Okay, let's do a quick clicker question here. Okay, which of these two is adipose tissue, A or B? Okay, a few more of you, go ahead and vote. Give you about 10 seconds. 62 of you so far, 63, maybe one more. Anybody else? There we go. Got our 64. Okay, let's see what you guys said. Okay, so about 91% of you are saying A. Okay, and then what's B? There we go. Yeah, so we got adipose and then simple squamous epithelium on the right. Okay, kind of look the same, not exactly. They're white cells, but the nucleus of the simple squamous cells is typically right in the middle. Not always, but more so in the middle. And they just obviously have a different look. Okay, any questions about those? Okay, all right, reticular connective tissue. So yeah, a couple of its functions. So it supports soft tissue of organs as well as small blood vessels. It creates this bed for free blood cells. So we tend to find this connective tissue in places or in organs that have one of their functions is dealing with blood cells in one way or another. Okay, so lymph nodes. This is where we find our lymphocytes, which are a good chunk of our white blood cells. Okay, they just kind of spend a lot of time in the lymphatic system. Okay, and so this connective tissue is kind of this net for them to just kind of be in. Okay, the spleen has lots of important functions as far as dealing with our blood, with our red blood cells in particular, and then bone marrow is where all of our blood cells are made. Okay, and so again, 3 locations that are all related to kind of dealing with blood cells in one way or another is where we find this connective tissue. Okay, so here's what it looks like. We can actually see the blood cells within them. Okay, so there's some leukocytes, white blood cells right there. Okay, has these reticular fibers throughout. Okay, somewhat. There's quite a few cells in these, pretty densely packed with cells compared to other connective tissues. Okay. All right, let's do another question here. Okay, go ahead. Which one of these is reticular connective tissue? All right, about another 10 seconds. Go ahead and vote if you haven't. A couple more of you. Yeah, 2 more people. All right, see what you guys said. Okay, so pretty much everybody's saying B there. And what's A? Areolar connective tissue. Good. Good job. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's keep moving on here. Let's move into a couple types that are going to be, we're going to find them in places that are a little bit more things that we think about. Okay. So for example, this dense regular connective tissue. Okay. Mostly all the fibers are parallel to each other in this. Okay. Very thick, dense collagen fibers. Okay. It has a direction to it. Okay. And you can kind of see that these lines, kind of these nice direction to the Achilles tendon there. Okay. Much more collagen, but there is some elastin as well. And the main cell type we would see there would be fibroblasts. Okay, so very good tensile strength in one direction. Okay, so it resists being stretched out when we're just pulling it right along the path of those fibers. Okay, but again, if we put a lot of tension on that Achilles tendon and then somebody hits us from the side while it has a lot of tension on it, it's not so good at handling that stress. Okay, but very good in that one line of pull that it typically experiences. Okay, so this is what we find in our ligaments and our tendons. Okay, and here's what it looks like. We can see those parallel fibers. Okay, there's a little bit of waviness to them, but not much. They're pretty much straight. Actually, once we stretch them out, once we put tension on it, then that waviness goes away completely. It just kind of completely flattens out. Okay, you can see some fibroblasts there. So that's dense regular. Okay, and then next is dense irregular. Okay, so we see much more waviness or swirled kind of look to the dense irregular. Okay, again, mostly fibroblasts. This is going to have good tensile strength in multiple directions. Okay, we're going to find this in places that need to get stretched out in multiple directions, like, for example, our skin. Okay, so the connective tissue underneath that, first we have the epithelial tissue in our skin, then we have that areolar connective tissue, and then underneath that, then we've got our dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, and that's all. Those bottom layers are all part of the dermis, which you'll learn about in the TBL stuff for Monday. Okay, we also find these in our joint capsules like this. Okay, so a joint like the shoulder joint, it's got to be able to withstand force this way, this way, this way. When you're down like this and this way, when you're up like this and this way, right? So all different directions, right? And that's what this type of connective tissue is really good at doing for us. Okay, and so it looks much wavier, right? We can see those fibroblasts, we can see the collagen fibers, but but much, much wavier than the parallel ones. Okay. All right, and so we can see a couple different different tissue types here. Okay, so that's a view of our skin there. Okay, that top layer of our skin is what type of tissue? Epithelial tissue. Okay, so that A is epithelial tissue. And what type of epithelial tissue? Stratified squamous, right? Stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, so we've got that on top. That's what A is. Okay, and then B is that layer that always goes underneath connective tissue. Okay, what was that one again? What kind of connective, or sorry, the layer that always goes out underneath epithelial tissue. What kind of connective tissue is that? Areola, okay. And we call that the papillary layer of the skin. We'll get, you'll see that on the slides for Monday, don't worry. But then finally, when we get to C, the lower part of the dermis, that's our reticular layer. It's called the reticular layer, which is kind of confusing because it's not reticular connective tissue. it's dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so let's write it here. So A is our stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, B is, I don't know how to spell areolar, sorry. Try that again. Areolar connective tissue. And then C is that dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so in that one slide, we've got 3 different tissue types. So again, if I'm asking you to identify one of those, I'll point out which one it is that we're talking about. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, so next type, elastic connective tissue, okay? It looks somewhat similar to dense regular, okay? But it's a little bit more wavy, okay? But instead of those big thick collagen fibers, we're gonna have elastin fibers instead. Okay, it's very elastic, which means it can recoil after stretch, right? We can stretch it out and then it bounces back very quickly. Okay, we find the 2 locations you need to know for these are the walls of our large arteries, okay, and then the walls of our bronchial tubes, okay? When you think of your large arteries, biggest one in your body is your aorta, right? Comes up out of your heart, comes this way. When the heart pumps that aorta, it actually stretches out the walls of the aorta, okay? When you feel your pulse in your wrist, that's what you're feeling. You're feeling that same stretch. It started in your aorta and went all the way down your vascular system. Okay, and so that helps because it can withstand the force of your heart and doesn't break, but it's also very helpful to keep up the speed of your blood flow too, because what happens is it stretches out and then it bounces back and kind of gives the blood a little push from behind and keeps it going, right? So it actually helps keep up the blood flow and that speed of blood flow by that quick bounce back that it does. Okay, all right, this is what it looks like. So much more packed with the fibers. They tend to have a darker look to them than the collagen fibers do. Okay, so let's do this one here then. All right. A few more people, go ahead and send it in. It's unanimous so far. Only got 61 though. A few more people out there. Send in your answer. 62. Okay, everybody's saying B. Okay, and what's A? Dense regular. Good, dense regular. And we got elastic here on the right. Good. Okay. Any questions on these? All right, let's keep rolling then. All right, let's talk about cartilage. So cartilage is kind of another category of connective tissue within connective tissue. And then underneath cartilage, we'll have different types of cartilage. Okay, so cartilage is avascular, okay? Just like epithelial tissue, it doesn't have a blood supply, okay? But it also doesn't have innervation by the nervous system. It doesn't have either one, okay? The primary cell type we'll see are chondrocytes. Okay, anytime you see that chondro or chond, that's going to be related to cartilage, and then the cyte again is just a cell. Okay, they're going to be found in these little hollow spaces called lacuna. Okay, they're like these little cells that they kind of trap themselves into. okay? Because the extracellular matrix is so hard that when they're releasing all this protein around them, then they pretty much just trap themselves in. But they have a little space around still that allows for some diffusion. Yeah, go ahead. Innervation is a connection to the nervous system. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks for asking that. So yeah, no nerve fibers really connect to cartilage. So typically when you have pain from a cartilage injury, it's usually due to either you've gone all the way through the cartilage into the bone a little bit, or just the process of inflammation that occurs in relation to the damage that you've had that could kind of inflame the whole area. But for the most part, there's not necessarily pain receptors right on your cartilage. Okay? Okay, so matrix is fairly solid, but not totally rigid like bone. Okay, it's very good with tension and compression. But the interesting part is it's 80% water. Okay, we wouldn't think of cartilage this way, but it's very, very wet. There's lots of water necessary for healthy cartilage. And it's always going to be associated with bone in some way, always connected to bone. Okay, so let's look at the first type. The first type is called hyaline cartilage. Okay, hyaline cartilage, when we look at it under the microscope, we see this kind of very clear, transparent matrix. Okay, we see a little bit of collagen, and then we can see those chondrocytes in the lacunae. Okay, so this is super rigid cartilage. Okay, very, very rigid, but also very, very smooth. Okay, makes for our nice, smooth joint surfaces when those bones rub up against each other in joints. It's always going to be hyaline cartilage, touching hyaline cartilage on both sides, and it allows for nice, smooth sliding. Okay. Also, this is what makes up the skeleton of the embryo. Okay. There's no bones in the fetus up until a certain point, and it's all hyaline cartilage. Okay, and then this is also what we find that helps us grow bone. So this is in those what's called those growth plates, or those epiphyseal plates, and the ends of our long bones. It's hyaline cartilage. Okay, so the locations we find these: articular cartilage on the ends of bones, the growth plate in our ribs, the costal cartilage that we saw yesterday, connecting those ribs up towards the sternum. That's hyaline cartilage. Okay, our nose, our trachea. So lots of different locations there. But this is super rigid, super smooth cartilage. Okay, here's what it looks like. You can see you can't really make out much as far as protein fibers go in the matrix. You can see the cells, and you can see the little lacuna that they're in. Okay. A lot of times when you see hyaline cartilage pictures, it almost looks like you can kind of see around the corner of a joint surface, and that's kind of what we're seeing here, right? Or it's kind of like wrapping around a little bit. Okay, that would be articular cartilage on the end of a long bone. Okay. All right, so that's hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is, maybe just put a big note to it, don't confuse this with elastic connective tissue. Okay, because that's very commonly done, is just mixing those two around. They're not the same tissue. One's cartilage, one's just a general connective tissue type. Okay, so it's somewhat similar to hyaline, but it also has the elastin proteins. So it bounces back, it retains its shape. Okay, very flexible and strong, but also retains its shape very well. Okay, so the two places you'll need to know: in your external ear and in your epiglottis, the little flap that covers over your respiratory tract when you're swallowing or sending things down your digestive tract. Okay, here's what it looks like. So we can see more protein fibers in elastic cartilage than we can in hyaline cartilage. Okay, so it kind of just has more of a fibrous look. It's a little bit more densely packed with those chondrocytes than hyaline cartilage is. Okay, a little bit closer view of it here. You can see those protein fibers pretty clearly there. Okay. All right, and then our last cartilage type is called fibrocartilage. Okay, so fibrocartilage has these big, thick bundles of collagen fibers. Okay, again, those chondrocytes, very good for compression forces. Okay, things smashing down on them, two bones coming together and smashing down. Very good for withstanding those forces. Also good for tensile strength, pulling apart. Right. So this is what makes up our discs between our vertebrae, right? Our intervertebral disc. Anytime we have an articular disc, which is also known as a meniscus, this is what it's made out of. Okay, so the meniscus in your knee, you have that meniscus up in your jaw. Some of you were searching around for the what was it called? Where the mandibular condyle goes in. the mandibular fossa, right? Some of you like can't find it. There's that, if you have on the model skull, there was that little piece of like rubber in there that was trying to be the articular disc of the temporal mandibular joint, which is your jaw. Some people can get lockjaw, it can get torn, and get kind of caught in there, and then their jaw gets stuck, right? So yeah, so that's it. And then also at the pubic symphysis there, where those two pubic bones come together. Okay, so here's what it looks like. Definitely less densely packed with chondrocytes. We can see a lot more protein fibers here. Okay, so it's very fibrous, fibrocartilage, very fibrous. There's another closer up image of it there. Okay, let's go ahead and do this. Well, it's not really a clicker question, but actually we can make it one. Just go ahead and try to label those 3 different types of cartilage, and send in the one that you might find on the end of long bones inside of a joint. Okay, on the end of long bones inside of a joint.
So hard to see. So the one that's long bones.
All right, so send in the one that you'd find on the end of long bones inside of joints. Okay. Got a few more of you to send it in here. All right, about 5 seconds. A couple more of you need to send it in. All right, see what you guys said. Okay, so about 86% of you are saying C. Okay, so, all right, what do we call A? Fibrocartilage, B, elastic, and C, hyaline. Good job. Okay, any questions on any of those cartilage types? All right, let's talk about 2 other tissue types here. So the first one is bone, okay? So bone, again, is highly vascular, obviously the predominant tissue of the skeleton. What we have inside a bone are called osteocytes, okay? So anytime we see that prefix osteo, I'm thinking of something related to bone, okay? These are also going to be in lacuna, okay? The extracellular matrix is going to be primarily made up of calcium phosphate salts and collagen. Okay, and that collagen portion is really important too. And right after, after we finish the skin, we'll dive into talking about bone in a little bit more depth and have a couple classes on bone. Yeah, okay. All right, so this is what it looks like under the microscope. Very unique as far as the way it looks, so it's not really going to get confused with any other tissue type. But we do have these little osteocytes over here. Okay, we'll talk about this whole thing called the Haversian system here in the next couple of weeks. But there's these little central canals where blood vessels and nerves pass through, and then there's these tiny little tunnels, pretty much, that connect from the vascular system in the center to all of these little cells, and those are called canaliculi, just like little canals. And that's how those little cells can still maintain some connection to nutrients. Okay, and then lastly, the one on the complete opposite spectrum from bone is blood. Okay, so about 40 to 45% of the volume of our blood is cells. Okay, and then it's also got a bunch of fibrous proteins in it. Many of those are blood clotting proteins. There's others as well. Okay. It's mostly fluid, obviously, but it can actually turn into gel when it needs to, right? Which is exactly what happens during the blood clotting process. Certain chemical events take place, and that liquid turns into a gel that's not moving, right? And so it's a pretty dynamic tissue that can change within a matter of minutes. Right? So main functions are all about transportation, right? Moving things around the body. Okay, and obviously we find it in the cardiovascular system. Okay, and pretty unique in the way it looks. Probably not going to get this confused with cartilage, but there it is. Okay. Okay. All right, so those are our tissue types. Just kind of one transitional thing as we move into talking about the skin is these covering and lining membranes. Okay, so the reason I kind of throw this in here is because this is kind of one of our first connecting points between when we actually have two tissue types coming together. We'll talk about that in the skin as well. But before that, we'll talk about these covering lining membranes. Okay, so they're composed of both epithelium and connective tissue. Okay, so there's a few different types. The cutaneous one, which we'll get into next week when we talk about the skin. Okay, what are known as serous membranes. We'll talk about those in a sec. And then mucous membranes. We've kind of been talking about those the whole time, the lining the respiratory tract, the digestive tract. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the serous membranes first. And so serous membranes are a unique structure that we find around organs that tend to move a lot. Okay, so we find some around our lungs because lungs expand and contract. Same thing with our heart; it's constantly beating, moving around. Okay, we have one around our. We have a couple on the next slide. I'll come back. We have some around our what's called our peritoneum, which is around our digestive tract mostly, our abdominal organs. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about this. So the idea with serous membranes is there's two separate layers. Okay, there's an outer layer, which is called the parietal layer, and then there's an inner layer, the one that's closer to the organ, called a visceral layer. Okay, and then in between those two layers is fluid. Okay, and that fluid is called serous fluid. Okay, and it's this lubricating fluid that helps for that movement of those organs that are constantly moving so much. Okay. And then within both the visceral and the parietal layers, we have both connective tissue and epithelial tissue. Okay, some of those epithelial tissue cells are actually the ones that create the serous fluid to make sure it stays nice and moist between those two layers of a membrane. Okay, yeah, one interesting thing about the pericardium. Okay, so the pericardium is the serous membrane of the heart. This is something that can be commonly involved in a pathology. So, for example, you can get something called pericarditis. Okay, so when that pericardium gets inflamed, what happens is you get buildup of fluid in that space where it's supposed to just be serous fluid. Okay, but it builds up with excess fluid and actually can start clamping down on your heart. Right, so much so that it can be a life-threatening condition. Can happen with the common cold, and unfortunately sometimes, if in very rare cases when that virus can make its way into your heart, it can turn into pericarditis, and the way that that's treated, and I'll show you more pictures of this next semester with the heart, but the way that's treated initially is to just stick a needle in there and actually pull the fluid off of the pericardium, right, to relieve that pressure off the heart. So that's one kind of clinical pathology. The other one would be mesothelioma. Okay, so the mesothelium is the serous membrane around your lungs. Okay, and so one of the things that has kind of been connected to this idea of mesothelioma is this plaque formation around the lungs in the serous membrane. One of the causes of this is breathing in asbestos, right? So people that have had heard about asbestos in an old house, in the popcorn ceilings or whatever, it's a highly toxic chemical. This is what it leads to if you breathe in too much of this. Typically people that worked around asbestos for long periods of time on ships and old houses and stuff can end up with mesothelioma, which is a degenerative lung condition. So. Yeah, so that's the serous membrane. Yeah, and we can see those three there. And we made it, guys. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you all next week.
That's what I said, page 2. I can't.
See ya. Bye. Have a good one. Yeah. Okay, have a good one, guys.